this is a tutorial on how to import skin meshes into 3D RAD. Skin meshes basically are the visual mesh that is used inside of the engine. It doesn't apply any physics, but it has a more complex system of how to apply shaders and textures and such. So I'm just going to show you the basic steps on how to get a basic skin mesh into the engine. You can also make an object with bones and animation and import it as well, or import a sequence of meshes to create an animation, and we'll get to that shortly. So I use Max. This is Max 9. Your tool might be similar in how they do the process, so we'll just go through a very basic process of building an object, and we'll just use the teapot provided by Max. I'm just gone ahead and actually lined it up to the bottom of the world because it actually uses your world coordinates to place the object inside of the map when you import it into 3D RAD. So if you're clicking on a surface on your ground or terrain, it's always kind of good practice to have the bottom of the object at 0 and then everything up from that point. It just makes everything a lot easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and apply temporary texture. Nothing's fancy, just my little test map. And this vehicle's in here kind of as a reference piece. You can have multiple objects in your scene, and you can export individual objects from Max, so you can have all of your pieces to make up whatever you're doing for your scene. And in the end result, you can just, if you need to fix only one of those items, you can just go to that one piece, export it back into 3D RAD, make your changes or whatnot, without having to redo every piece. Now that we have the object created, if you want to create a shadow for this, you actually have to let's make a duplicate of this object. Shadows actually have to be a solid mesh. So looking at this object, I'm going to go ahead and turn the back faces off. So now that you can see there's actually gaps in this mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and convert it to an editable poly so I can mess with it. And these gaps here are actually bad. What you need when you're creating a shadow, you actually need the mesh to be completely solid. And a good way to check that in here is actually use the border tool to check for edges. And you can see we have open edges abundant. So I'm going to go ahead and actually cap these off. If I can find it, I had to shrink my window considerably. There we go. Cap. I think the only one left now is the top. Alright, I'm going to cheat this one just a little bit. Okay. And then I'm going to use my weld tool to weld the vertices. There we go. Just need the edges. Cool. Now, one thing you might want to look out for is you don't want to have too complex of a shadow, especially because it's not going to apply on the object. It's applying to separate surfaces. So, in all practical cases, usually, you don't need it to be as complex. But we're just going to go with this model for now. An option, you could use multi-res, which is an option in Max. It's a kind of a quick and dirty way to do it. Or just go ahead and if you just make like a very simple outline of the object, and then you can use that as a shadow, because shadow meshes are very taxing on the engine, so you want to try to keep those minimal as possible. Alright, getting to the naming conventions, when you're importing a skin mesh, there's several ways to do it. One of the easy ways is actually to import it into a folder that you create. You give it the name of the object, so this in case would be teapot. But inside of the folder, you'll be importing the models into the directory to represent the visual and the shadow piece of your mesh. So we'll go ahead and I name my objects inside of Max to get the idea. So what we want to do is actually number the mesh. Since it's only one, we name it 000, which is the lowest number it can go, underscore mesh, and .x. Now the mesh naming is actually very important. The engine will look for anything ending in the word mesh in order to find the correct visual piece. And the same goes for the next object. You have to correlate the number 000 and shadow. So anytime the object loads up the teapot mesh, it'll load the default 000 mesh, and then it'll correlate the same number 000 underscore shadow. So it'll look for these two objects to make the model. So let's go ahead and export. So we'll export the visual piece first. And what you want to do is you go to your 3D RAD folder and 3D RAD res objects, and then find your skin mesh folder right here. And then within data, you'll have several folders in here that you can go into. And what we're going to actually do is there's already a folder in here. I've already gone ahead and named it teapot. So what you do is you'd create whatever mesh you're making. Go ahead and create the name of the object. Then inside of it, go ahead and export your model. .000 underscore mesh.x, and I use the PandaSoft exporter. If you're using PandaSoft, a good setting would be to, in your output options, you can check mesh definitions, materials, and inline. You don't need to check include animations or bones, because we're not exporting anything with an animation correlated with bones or whatnot. You can leave your mesh to normal or optimize. Your object type, geometric. You actually can export dummies and they can control bones, but we're not doing anything complex. Mesh normals can be checked, and mapping coordinates. So if you've applied mapping to your object, you want to retain those coordinates. You don't need any kind of entry inside of your animation unless you have an animation. You don't need to convert your texture with it, so none. In your X file settings, the DX settings here will actually work. Any three of these will work: text, binary, or binary with compression. This is basically if you want to try to save on size. If you have a large download, you want to export with your top frame only, because it's only one frame. If you were exporting with multiple frames, if you had an animation, you need to export subframe hierarchy. And always check left-handed access. After that, that's everything. So go ahead and OK.